Welcome. This is a webinar on the Governing Knowledge Commons Research Framework, which I'll refer to as the GKC framework. The webinar is part of a collection of teaching resources being collected by the Ostrom Workshop. I hope that viewers will find the materials useful. You can always find out more about the GKC framework at knowledgecommons.net. So my name is Brett Frischmann, and I have listed three other collaborators, Mike Madison, Madeline Sanfilippo, and Catherine Strandberg, who are collaborators I've worked with on many other GKC projects, but they're also co-PIs on an NSF-funded research coordination grant for the Governing Knowledge Commons research. But the GKC is itself a knowledge commons. It's an open and supportive community of researchers, teachers, and students. And so there are many others involved. And we're, of course, hoping that maybe you'll join the effort. So to date, we've published a number of books on knowledge commons that have developed the framework, brought together folks from many different disciplines, and collected a series of case studies across different fields. Most of these can be found online, and more are on their way. So again, check out the website for more information and to get involved. And let's begin our discussion of knowledge commons. So there's basically three preliminary questions that we want to start with. What are knowledge commons? Why knowledge commons? Why do they matter? And how do knowledge commons, how do they work? So commons generally refers to a form of community management or governance. So it applies to resources and it involves a group or a community of people. But commons is not a resource. It's not the community or a place or a thing. Commons is the institutional arrangement of these elements. So the basic characteristic that distinguishes commons from non-commons is the institutionalized sharing of resources among members of a community. And governance of and by the community is critical. It can apply to a wide range of different resources, from natural resources of the sort that Ostrom and many of her colleagues studied to knowledge resources. So for our purposes, knowledge is going to refer to a broad set of intellectual and cultural resources. We deliberately cast a wide net so that we can capture data, information, science, knowledge, creative works, inventions, and so on. All of these resources are what economists call public goods, meaning they're non-rivalrously consumed and thus they're cheaply shareable. So the next question is, why knowledge commons? Why should communities manage these kinds of resources as commons? Why should we bother sharing them? Well, sharing allows people to leverage non-rivalry, to consume, sure, but to learn and to generate even more knowledge. Knowledge resources are inputs and outputs into complex systems like science and culture. Further, many knowledge resources are infrastructural. They're general purpose inputs that generate many different outputs, allowing us to build, to innovate in many different directions. Many knowledge communities, whether scientific or cultural or educational or otherwise, are defined by community norms of sharing. So how do we go about managing knowledge resources as a commons? Well, often we think of, you'll hear people talk about knowledge commons as the public domain or open access, where open access refers to making the resources available to everyone, right? Everyone gets access. And this actually works for some resources, especially for some knowledge resources like ideas and facts. But for most knowledge commons, right, governance is more complicated. It's complex, contextual. It depends on the resources you're talking about, and they're community specific. There's much more to knowledge commons than openness. There's often a distinction between members and non-members of a community in terms of who gains access and on what terms. Moreover, there are many different kinds of dilemmas to overcome. and that requires governance. So how do we get motivated to create this knowledge commons framework? Well, a few of us started out as intellectual property scholars who studied how intellectual property, like patents and copyrights, are used to generate or incentivize the generation of new inventions and cultural works. And we recognized that standard intellectual property theory was overly simplistic. There is this dichotomy between property rights and the public domain as to management strategies. For those of you who have already watched the webinars on the IAD framework or on the tragedy of the commons, some of this will sound familiar. Because much like Hardin's tragedy of the commons allegory, which for natural resources suggested that tragedy was inevitable unless you could solve the problem, avoid tragedy with one of two solutions, right? Either private property enabled markets or government can command and control regulation to take over. And it turns out that a very similar sort of tragic allegory exists with respect to knowledge resources. Right? If knowledge is shared freely and openly, if it's managed as a commons, well, rational free riding. Free riders will just come in and they will ruin it for everyone. Incentives will go away because people will free ride on the investments of others. And it turns out that this free riding story is pervasive, and it leads to two kinds of solutions: intellectual property to enable markets to function, or the government can intervene and provide direct subsidies. But it turns out that these two solutions to the free rider problem or dilemma are incomplete solutions. It turns out that knowledge communities often do collaborate and manage their resources as a commons without tragic results, without ruin, without incentives to destroy the knowledge commons. It turns out that communities often can overcome these dilemmas. And the difficult question is how? So when Ostrom confronted a similar sort of set of questions with respect to the tragedy of the commons and natural resources, right, she constructed a framework and she worked with many others to study real world examples of communities that manage their resources as a commons, sometimes successfully, sometimes less so. I'm not going to dwell much on Ostrom's IAD framework, or Institutional Analysis and Development Framework, which is what the GKC framework is based on. If you haven't already, I encourage you to watch the instructional video. But the idea behind the Ostrom approach of constructing a framework that enables the development of theory, it organizes empirical inquiry, it allows you to do comparative analysis across different domains. This was inspiring to us. So the IAD framework enabled structured case study analysis, right? So you could study a whole bunch of different things, whether it was a soccer league or a fishery or agricultural cooperatives. You could look at repeat interactions in an action arena. You could study the different characteristics of the environment and the people involved and the community involved and the rules in use that structured those interactions. And you could study the pattern of interactions over time, and that would give you a basis for evaluation and comparison. The basic idea here is that, the basic results are that we get, after decades of research, we get a series of design principles for governing sustainable resources as a commons. And we were motivated in developing the GKC framework to develop a similar approach. But we don't anticipate the same exact set of design principles emerging from our research with respect to intellectual resources, because intellectual resources or knowledge resources are different from natural resources in important ways. One of which I've already mentioned, which is the non-rivalrous nature of the resource, and another of which is that the resources must be created and not just managed. In other words, we have to come up with resources in the first place, and so incentives, incentives to create and sustain and cultivate matter. So when we develop the ID, we take the ID framework as from a starting point, we realize that, well, actions within action arenas produce resources that are then fed back into the knowledge commons. At the same time, the outcomes generate resources. So when we're looking at patterns of interactions, right, we're going to have a feedback effect. The bottom line is that an action arena is a recurring type of situation where community actors interact with each other, and these interactions in an action arena produce outcomes and generate patterns that you can study, right? And so resource characteristics and community attributes, these are all in the governing rules and use are all these inputs that affect what happens in an action arena. So over time, as patterns of interactions accumulate that feed back into new action situations, right, influencing things over time in a dynamic way, new knowledge resources can be produced, and that can define and redefine the community in different ways. And these are the kinds of things we want to pay attention to. And so the governing knowledge commons framework basically looks a little bit like the ID framework with a couple of extra feedback loops in there. And the idea is that it facilitates the examination of resource sharing in dynamic local settings in a broad variety of different contexts. And then we can study and compare and learn over time together. So another sort of cheat sheet for doing and thinking about knowledge, the governing knowledge commons framework is currently on in front of you. This is a lot of text on a slide, and I apologize for that. But what I want you to note is just the structure and the approach. These are like representative research questions organized around those different categories in that diagram. So you've got a common set of questions and variables that you can use when that shape your interviews, your document review, your analysis of data, and so on. And these common sets of questions, right, also enable you to do comparative analysis and learning. So we're going to focus on the background environment, right, the attributes of the commons, or in other words, the resources, the community members, the goals and objectives that they may have, right, that shapes the rules and use. And then we're going to look at the governance structures and ask a series of questions about the governance mechanisms that are used by the community. Who makes decisions, how are decisions made, who's included, and so on and so forth. And then we've got a series of patterns and outcomes that help us with the evaluation. Now, through a series of knowledge commons studies that have been published already and others that are in the works, we've started to learn some things. And so I want to just share with you a few observations before I quickly close. Observations so far. So far, we've recognized that social dilemmas addressed by knowledge commons can relate to a variety of different problems, right? There can be multiple creation, curation, coordination dilemmas that arise on both the demand side and the supply side, or both at once. So one example to think about is in the context of sort of medical knowledge commons, for example. On the demand side, there may be creation, curation, coordination dilemmas with regard to patients, coordinating patients and patient data. On the supply side, it may be that clinicians and research need to be coordinated in different ways, and they run into different dilemmas on their side in terms of coordination. And at the same time, on both the supply and the demand side, there may be some dilemmas to overcome with regard to the investment in certain infrastructure or tools that are needed for the knowledge to be generated and shared. Another interesting observation across a series of case studies, and I'll come back to the complex nested systems, the second one. If I jump to the third, is that it's really important to identify shared infrastructure within knowledge commons communities, because these shared infrastructure often reduce the costs or barriers to cooperation. They often act as substitutes for governance. They require relatively large upfront investments, so sometimes they present their own supply side dilemmas. They often are provided by an external source, so it gets you to think about the role or involvement of outside members, people who are outside, or institutions outside of the community, for example, the government. Another interesting set of observations across case studies is the key role of trusted leadership. This often often will be a subject matter expert, and it often can lead to sort of some interesting things to think about with regard to hierarchical versus consensus-based decision-making in certain knowledge communities. Another observation that we found interesting across case studies is that governance structure often evolves over time. So you need to pay attention to the history of the community that you're studying, and you want to think about, there's a good case to be made, you want to think about doing longitudinal studies of knowledge commons across time. Commons governance turns out to be particularly important, it seems, in early stages of industry or technology development. There are also a complex and varied set of relationships between knowledge commons communities and outside institutions, such as government, where the government can act and play an important role in shaping the goals and objectives of the community itself. They may contribute to the generation of infrastructure that's shared, and there's a host of other sort of interactions that are quite interesting. So I want to give you a quick illustration as I close of the second observation about nested commons and the importance. I'll use the example of the Rare Disease Clinical Research Network. This was established in 2003 by the NIH. It's essentially a network of research consortia, each of which are dealing with a different cluster of rare diseases. The basic idea is that the RDCRN is itself a knowledge commons, that the goal of which is to explore methods for doing and conducting rare disease research. So you're establishing a series of shared resources for different research consortia. I just want to show you a few pictures to show you what we mean by nested commons. So at a very macro level, you can see the RDCRN itself is a knowledge commons. The members in that commons include some offices at the NIH and a steering committee, but also a whole bunch of different research consortia, right? These are nationally, sort of spread out across the country. The UCDC, the Urea Cycle Disorder Consortium, is one that we studied, right? But these are just different research consortia. But each consortium is a member of this knowledge commons at the macro level. But if we zoom in on one, right? If we zoom in on the UCDC consortia and we look at the meso level, it turns out that that consortium is itself a knowledge commons that faces different dilemmas and has different goals and objectives and involves different members. The members of the UCDC or any other research consortia involve a bunch of different clinical research sites also spread across the country, different entities like NIH officers that are involved, different the patient advocacy group. Again, a different member, different stakeholders solving different knowledge problems at the meso level. If we were to zero in and zoom in on one clinical research site, say at a certain university hospital or something, right? And this is at the micro level, we would again see a knowledge commons operating at the micro level in a particular site or location, different members, different people involved, different dilemmas to overcome. And yet at the micro, macro, meso, and macro level, there are interactions that matter and are worthy of study. So I hope this has given you some incentive and some excitement about joining the Knowledge Commons community. There are, again, more resources to be found online, and I hope this was helpful for you. Thanks.